All right, so welcome everyone to this Thursday afternoon, February 20th, 2025. My name is Emily Mora. I am on the board with Decoding Dyslexia North Carolina, and happy to welcome you this afternoon, whether you're watching this live or later a recording. This is sort of one of our lunch and learns. I don't know if you've joined us in the past. We've had some other wonderful guests, including Legal Aid of North Carolina, join us, but just an opportunity to casually meet, talk, ask questions, and hear from our expert speaker. And I am honored to welcome Dr. Rebecca Felton today. She has just a quick intro. She has her PhD in child development and special education, which is what she has been pouring into during her career, including being a faculty member at multiple universities, being a researcher, including and especially in the area of dyslexia and reading disabilities. She has been a key member of the North Carolina State Improvement Project and helped to develop the reading research and practice professional development program that our wonderful educators can use across the state. She now is a literacy consultant, does reading evaluations and IEP support for families across North Carolina. So we are so honored to have her and her expertise with us today. And we're focusing on goals, growth, and the gap. So that was what we were hoping Dr. Felton would speak to us regarding today. And then we can open it up to questions around that. And just one note, as much as possible, we welcome any and all questions, but trying to keep them as broad and general as possible. What should someone do in this situation, or what can I ask in this situation, as opposed to giving, for example, specific test scores for a specific student, et cetera. If you're needing any specific targeted student support, please email us directly, decodingdyslexianc@gmail.com. If we cannot help, we will pass that on to someone who can. And without further ado, welcome Dr. Felton.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to start with what I think are the factors that impact IEP development, which goals and growth is part of. I'm not going to get into, unless there's specific questions about the issue of identifying a kid with a specific learning disability, but more once that identification has been made, then what goes into an IEP? A lot of the parents I work with are not as knowledgeable as probably most of you are. And they really are overwhelmed often by just the process and all the steps. So I think there are three things that are important to know about sort of the background. First of all, North Carolina Department of Public Instruction has policies that talk in fairly general terms, but some specifics about how an IEP is to be developed, what it has to include. So that's one source of information. Then at this point in time, I think all schools in North Carolina are using the ECATS system, which is a template into which information in an IEP goes. And what I have learned in some of the IEP meetings I'm in is that the ECAT system to some degree drives some aspects of IEP development. So there's some things that are required that have to be put in. And there's sometimes when things that I have asked to be included, I'm told, well, ECATS doesn't have a way to do that. So the ECAT system is something that parents need to understand. And then also another layer is that school systems, and to some degree even individual schools, have policies sometimes. Like I'll have IEP teams tell me, well, we always put in 80% proficiency as the goal. So that's there. That's not written anywhere. at a state level. So when parents are thinking about, or professionals are thinking about IEP development, all of those levels are things that we need to keep in our mind. And I've got some references or some suggestions for resources which we can share. I'm sure Decoding Dyslexia has all of these, but one of them that's particularly good for helping parents is the ECAC organization. They have lots of documents that talk about different parts of IEP development. So I think the more parents know going into an IEP, the better advocates they can be. So the first question that was posed related to goals, and the question was posed to me as, are these the right goals? So that is an important question and is, I think, really the heart of the IEP. And the first thing I would like to say about that is that the goals and whether they're right or not for the student really depends on the nature of the reading problem. And I'm going to focus all on reading at this point. So what we know about reading is, but not all parents know this, is that reading can involve problems at the word level. So kids can have trouble just accurately and efficiently reading words. It can include problems with decoding and irregular words. It can include problems with phonological awareness. Often what I see in IEP goal development is that the goal is often something that's far in the future. Supposed to be an annual goal, but often it seems to me much more global than that. And often annual goals include or focus on primarily a lot of times fluency rather than the skills that are necessary to develop fluency. So when we're looking at goals, we need to be sure we have good data on what the students' actual reading problems are. So in addition to word level reading problems, we also can have problems with spelling and then broader problems with other aspects of written expression. And then we can have problems with comprehension. Another thing I often see happening is that the goals are comprehension focused, even though the part of the problem is that the kid can't read the words. So all of those areas need to be assessed as part of the IEP development. And it's really a crucial part because all the goals are supposed to be based on data. And determining whether a child is progressing is based on what the baseline is. So the data that's included in the IEP in terms of that ultimately leads to present level of performance is critical. And I'm noticing too, sometimes in IEP that I get, the only data that's been collected is based on screening instruments, things like M-class or core decoding, which we started using back in the year 2000. And it's a good instrument, but it's a screener. So one of the things that I would like to suggest that parents ask for is what actual instruments have been used to develop the data that goes into determining what the child's needs are and what their baseline is in each of those areas of need, and that the sources of the data should also include, in addition to screening instruments, it should include some standardized testing that goes deeper than screening instruments. And we can talk about that a little bit more. So I think what parents should do is request, this is prior to an IEP meeting, they should request specific information about how each of their concerns, theirs and the teacher's concerns about the child's reading, will be tested. And then very specific information about the data that's collected. I also recommend that before IEP meetings, parents request a draft IEP. Most schools that I have worked with will honor that if you ask for it. That's not always available, but it really helps to have in front of you an IEP that you can then look at and come up with questions based on, rather than just try to do it in real time when you're looking just at the screen. I also suggest that parents ask about, once the goals are being developed, ask what resources are going to be used to address those goals. And by that, I mean, I know schools will not put in a specific reading program or any kind of instructional program by name, which I understand, but they certainly should provide parents or professionals with information about what's to be used. And in addition, I often ask, what training has the teacher had in delivering that particular reading program or comprehension program? So I think the more information that parents and professionals can have who are going in, as I do, as advocates about what is being proposed and what the resources are, what the training of the person who's going to provide it, the better off will be. In terms of how these areas are to be evaluated over time, what is typical is for a generic progress monitoring instrument to be stated as what's going to be used. They don't usually even name them, but they'll just say progress monitoring tools or whatever. I personally don't think that's sufficient. I understand why that's used, and it serves a purpose, as we'll talk about a little bit more. But if a school is using a reading program that has a scope and sequence, or any kind of curriculum with a scope and sequence, then in addition to the more generic progress monitoring tools like words correct per minute, for example, on some tool, I recommend that parents ask to be written into the IEP that the mastery data from the program that's being used be included in as part of the progress monitoring. Now, I have been told sometimes that that's not possible to put in because of ECATs. Other people seem to be able to figure out how to do that. But at the very least, it needs to be documented in the minutes or documented at some point in the IEP, because otherwise, as a couple examples I'll give, it can look like the child's making good progress, but when you look at what's happening in the curriculum they're using, it's a different picture. So I want to give one example, and then I'm going to stop and see if there are any questions there before we go in and talk about growth and the gap. So this is a little boy who was in 2nd grade, and his M-class scores prior to being identified as having a learning disability were in the below to well below benchmark area. Decoding, he could decode 2- and 3-letter words a little better than he could do some other tasks. His KTA, which is a standardized tested, showed him very low range on decoding and comprehension low. But his IEP goals were focused almost completely on grade level reading, accuracy and rate, and there were no decoding goals. in a comprehension goal. So I don't think, I think being able to ask questions about the data showed this need, let's say decoding, and yet I don't see that reflected in the goal. How is that going to be measured? And in my experience, progress monitoring instruments like MClass are not particularly helpful with that. But the mastery test in a program would be. So I'm gonna stop there and see if anyone has a question.
Yes, thank you. We do. I have one follow-up question, and we do have another in the chat, and then we'll see if there are any others. So with regards to that mastery data being included, just as an example, for example, with that student you were talking about, um, reading CVC simple short vowel words. You would want that specific data he's able to get 0%, 25%, whatever percent accuracy, and what kind of errors he's making reading those simple CVC words as a baseline, correct? So that then you can see mark that progress over time with reading CVC words. Is that what you're saying with regards to that mastery data being included?
Yeah, so wherever that child, whatever that child has actually been taught,
Mhm.
what is their mastery level? And how is most reading programs have mastery guidelines,
Mhm.
at least. So using those guidelines, you know, we can look at over time how long a child stays at a certain level. How long does it take that child to master CVC words? And I think I rarely see that in progress reports. And I think it's critical. I think it's a whole different way of looking at whether the child's making good progress compared to MClass data. Not that one's good and one's not. They're just they're two different ways to look at children's progress.
Great. Yes, thank you. That makes sense. We also had a question in the chat. Does a teacher, educator, special educator, do they have to share their level of training or experience with a program or tool? Do they have to do that? Or you obviously have the right to ask and you hope they will share that, but do you know if by law they are required to tell you that information?
I don't know of a law that says that they have to.
Mm.
If someone chooses not to share that, would make me very suspicious. I mean, I don't think it necessarily means that a teacher's not able to do a good job.
Mhm.
But as we talk about the next couple of topics we're going to talk about, it can be a factor to consider. I have seen many teachers who don't have as good training as they could have, ideally, but can do a very good job. And I've seen other teachers who don't really understand enough to teach certain children. So I think it's better to always ask than not.
Absolutely. Completely agree. Does anyone else have any questions? Does that spark any other questions around the topic of goals, um, generating those goals, asking questions to the IEP team about what would be appropriate? Okay. Okay. We have a new question. How do you, as an outside tutor invited by the parents as an advocate, respond to the special educator putting comprehension as an IEP goal, but not addressing the underlying issues as you were speaking of, whether it was phonological awareness, rapid recall, etc.? So how do you find a way to approach that diplomatically in those meetings?
Well, I think the first thing is to be sure that data on the problems the child has, other than comprehension, are present. So if it hasn't even been tested and it's not in the present level of performance, all you could say is, we know from reading research that a huge factor in comprehension is whether or not the child can read the words accurately and efficiently. This needs to be tested. So it would require further testing. I mean, I try to respond to research, National Reading Panel, things like that that are sort of out there, not just opinions. If, and this is more common, situations where the problem, let's say in decoding, is documented, but they have chosen not to address it. I try to suggest that it's important to know what's contributing to the problem and to address that so we'll know if we're addressing all of the issues. It's never the only issue. So what I like to see is at least a decoding word reading goal in addition to comprehension. Same thing for fluency. A lot of times, like this little boy who's I mentioned to you, his goal was to, be a fluent reader in grade level material. And he was, I mean, he was hardly a reader at all. So that was not going to happen. But,
Right.
so,
Yeah. No, thank you so much. We have another question. So it says NC check-ins and EOG testing. If the child is not passing those, what are your thoughts or advice around how to address this with the school or the child? If the child is still receiving services, right, and they're obviously significantly behind grade level, but they're still getting that NC check-in or EOG testing, how is that fair to the child?
so is the question of whether or not the child should be tested or whether or not it's an accurate reflection of whether he's making progress?
This is Heidi. Thank you so much for answering some of these questions. Your question back was,
So,
should they be tested? I mean, that's a great, would NC check in, like it stresses the child out? Should you hold them back, like not send them that day? Like, what is the value of some of these standardized tests?
well, and are you asking as a parent, Heidi?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So, I mean, and I think that's a common concern for parents. It is schools really, they are required by law to test kids.
Hmm.
So they honestly don't have an option. And we could debate whether or not that is meaningful or not, but that is the law at this point. So I think it is really up to parents to make a judgment about whether it's emotionally harming to their particular student or not. And I've had
Okay.
plenty of parents who have chosen to keep their child out of school on those days. And it's really a judgment call because the testing, while it's required by state law and serves a purpose in terms of documenting how many kids aren't doing well, but that to me it really doesn't help us teach the child anything because we already
Mhm.
know the child
Right.
is behind and can't read. So you just have to decide what's important for your particular child. And I think most schools, I've never known of anyone to be parent to like get in trouble for doing that. That may have happened, but not that I'm aware of.
Thank you.
Was that what you were trying to get at, Heidi? That aspect of testing?
Yes, my son's middle school and kind of maybe some guilt from the school of not doing great on the NC check-in. So I'm just wondering, is it valuable information for his progress, or is it something that I should focus more on the special services, like the extra services he's receiving, and not worry about the standardized testing?
Yeah, well, I don't honestly know check-in data as well, but
Mhm.
I would say certainly you should be getting more pertinent and important data from his special services
Gotcha.
if they're working on his problems. That would what I
Thank you.
value in. And you can ask that teacher, does she learn anything from the check-ins?
Okay, that's a good point. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all for your questions. Any other questions? And certainly if you think of it later, we can come back to it, but otherwise we'll move on to that growth and closing the gap
Yes.
question.
Okay, so growth in the gap, and sort of the sub questions are, is my child making progress? Is the progress enough to close the gap, and how do I know? This is a big, a big issue. So I'm going to give you just some general comments that things I have been told from DPI in the past, and some more recently, about progress monitoring and what it should look like. And then we're going to talk about some ways to interpret scores. So I've already said that we shouldn't just depend on generic progress monitoring, such as the child will read grade level material or instructional level material at so many words per minute at, such percentage of the time. That can be measured by things like words per minute data. It's not specific to the skills the kid's being taught. So in addition to that sort of data, we need more specific information about what he's been taught and how he's responding to that instruction. So in that understanding, all information about progressing toward goals depends on having accurate baseline data to start with, and then using the correct tools to measure. So tools should be sensitive to change over time and take only a short amount of time to administer. So one of the things, and I understand both of those needs, because we all know situations where, at least I've seen multiple times in the last few years,
Okay.
situations where teachers
Yeah. No, yes.
only teach 4 days out of the week, and then one whole day is spent on testing. So we don't want to overload teachers with testing. So we need to use things that are sensitive to change over time and are fairly quick to administer. I suggest that parents always ask for the details on how the testing is going to be done, how often it's going to be done, who's going to do it, when is it going to be done, and also request that in addition to those required progress monitoring instruments, that the teacher, the EC teacher, provide mastery test data. So the goal of specially designed instruction is to reduce the child's risk, the degree to which they're behind, over time. So we have referred to that as closing the gap. And I asked some colleagues in preparation for this if that's still considered a goal. It's referenced in the state guidelines to some degree in a very generic way. So I think we have to always keep in mind, if our end goal is to close the gap, at least decrease the gap between where a student is and where they need to be academically on target, then we have to remember that that's how we need to be looking at the progress monitoring, not just is the child progressing, because almost any child who is in a situation with a teacher who's specially trained and using specially trained, design materials will progress, fortunately. But the really question is, are they progressing at a rate that has a chance of catching them up in any realistic frame line? So one of the things that has been suggested in terms of just ways to look at data is to look at it in terms of whether or not or how efficiently the gap is being closed. So, for example, some teachers use graphs of data, others don't. But if you're looking at all data can be graphed. So if you're imagining a data points, let's just say words correct per minute in a text reading. There are three basic kinds of patterns that have been identified. One is that the child, they call it the trend line. So you look at what the child was like before instruction, and then you look at when instruction started, what the trend line is. And if you see that the trend line is going up, it's steeper once specially designed instruction has begun, then that means the child is responding. So another what type of pattern you might see is a flat line where there's no difference. And there are lots of reasons that could be. Maybe the wrong skills being measured, maybe the tool's not appropriate, maybe the intervention's not being provided with fidelity, lots of reasons. But so you can have basically, there's no big difference between what we're doing now and what we did before. Another kind of pattern is that it can be just highly variable and no real pattern to it. And you have to look at things like, is something happening with the child's attention, his behavior, his engagement? There's all sorts of possibilities. The other one, which is the most interesting and can be the most troubling, but that I rarely see discussed, is what is described as a slow rate of improvement. So the trend line is improving, but if you compare it to the goal line, which there needs to be a goal, it's not increasing as steeply as the goal. Now, I don't think I've ever seen that put in a progress report, but what that indicates is that even if we stay on this trajectory, so the kid's progressing, he's not progressing at a rate that's going to catch him up. So he may make a year's progress, which would be wonderful in some respects. But if he's 3 years behind, he's never going to catch up. So that way of looking at the data is, I think, the only way we can really make a legitimate assessment of whether or not the child is progressing at a rate fast enough to catch up. So I want to talk about that a little bit more, but I want to see if there's questions at this point or comments, because I see Melanie Sharp and Bridget Bilba on here. So we've got lots of experts on here. Those are just ones I know, not that the rest of you aren't experts.
So would it be appropriate for, so let's say the family is getting that progress report along with the report card, or maybe they've called an IEP meeting because they're wondering that same thing. Are we making enough progress? Maybe the parents have been given just some data points just written, on December 5th, they performed this way with reading CVC words. January 1st, they did this. February, they did this. But there isn't a visual like you're describing, showing kind of the goal and the trend line. And would it be appropriate for families to ask for that, to see sort of a graphing for how that goal is going to be met and how they're going to be caught up? Is that something a family could ask for, as opposed to, I know a lot of times I just see a few individual data points next to a date. and so it might be hard for families to visualize, well, are we going where we need to go fast enough?
I think it's appropriate to ask. I know ECATS does have a process for putting data into it, and within it will provide different kinds of trend lines. So I think it's very appropriate to ask for that. I don't know that that's something that most teachers are used to doing, but it is a possibility in ECATS. And if it's not something they're proficient at doing, or it makes sense, then I think the parent could at least ask, can you tell me how is this progress above expected progress? So is this progress enough to start catching up? And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment.
Thank you. Any other thoughts or questions from anyone? Feel free to unmute yourselves or post in the chat.
This is Heidi. I had another question. I don't want to ask them all. You said use the word correct tools to measure when you started this piece. What about, I think I have questions with the school about, we disagree on the, like fluency, for example, and what fluency passages they're using and if it's grade level. When you say correct tools to measure, how could I ask around the school of, are they using grade appropriate or where he's at level appropriate tools to measure?
I mean, I think that's a very legitimate question, because that should be reflected in the goal. It should say he's either being tested on grade level material.
But who defines grade level?
Well, the materials that they're using are designated as by grade level.
So if they're pulling something off the internet and the internet says it's 7th grade, just because that passage off the internet says it's 7th grade, would you say that that would be? Is this
No.
a trick question? I'm not trying to trick.
No, it's not a trick question. It's a great question. So there is no single gold standard for determining whether something is 7th grade.
Right.
So you can have, there are lots of ways of doing that. There are different rubrics. And it's always something that should be taken with a grain of salt, because you can have a whole book of 7th grade passages, and they can be extremely different in terms of how easy it is for any particular student to read them. So that's why they should, if they're using something, first of all, they should be using a source for graded passages that's got some credibility.
And what would that credibility look like?
Well, it would be a well-known source that's been using rubrics that they describe how they decide it's 7th grade. So there are sources out there that have been around a long time. There are more than one, but I think always with a grain of salt. If it's you're designate something at a certain grade level, it's always going to be true more or less, because there are many other factors other than just what the rubric usually does is evaluate the words that are in that text as to how difficult they are and come up with this is 7th grade. But there's so many other factors that would impact whether or not a child could read those. But if you have a good source of information about the grade level, and you're using multiple examples, multiple data points, then you should be able to get a good picture. Well, he could read 5 of the 10. What was different? Maybe he had good background knowledge on those 5 and didn't know anything about the others. So you start to try to use good common sense to figure it out. But you should never be asking a kid to read, when you're testing fluency or measuring fluency and accuracy, you should never be asking them to read something that's beyond the level at which they have shown they can accurately read individual words. So that's why some goals have instructional level. That means they've done some measure of what level of individual words that student can read accurately.
That's good.
So you
Thank
just
you.
need to ask more questions. Don't hesitate to ask questions about it. And if you ask to see the passages that your child has read, see if you can figure out, sit down with the teacher and see if you can figure out what it is about some that he's doing great and some he's not, or if they're just inappropriate for him altogether. His
Thank you.
accuracy level ought to be high if they're appropriate for him. So if he can't read with at least 90% accuracy, then it's not an appropriate level for him, no matter what the content is.
Thank you for asking the question, Heidi. That was great. We appreciate that. Any and all questions or comments are welcome. All right. So yes, so Dr. Felton, whatever other thoughts you have around that growth and closing the gap.
Okay, I want to share another example of a child who is in the 3rd grade. He had been documented to have very poor decoding skills, multiple measures. His annual goal on his IEP was that he would read grade level text at 25 words per minute with 96% accuracy. This is a student I was asked to consult with and actually tested. So his special ed teacher just sent me his mid-year report. And the report said, the child was close to completing the first level of the Spire reading curriculum, level 1. That's out of 8 levels, which basically focuses on word level basic decoding skills. So he has been in specially designed instruction since the beginning of this school year and was not quite through with level 1. So hold that thought for a moment, because then the EC teacher went on to say that this student's M-class scores showed well above average growth in word reading fluency. Okay. So now he's working on CVC words mostly in the Spire curriculum. And he had not mastered CVC not totally, when I saw him in the fall. So he's well above average growth in word reading fluency, which if you had a graph, that would show he's closing the gap in word reading fluency. His growth in letter sounds and decoding was average, which I take that to mean he wasn't gaining any ground, but he wasn't losing any. So my take on that, those 2 pieces of information, one is that he's taken half a year of instruction. He's been getting instruction daily in a group in a good reading program. And he's almost completed level 1 out of 8 levels, which are necessary. That's sort of the scope of decoding. And Beth, you can help me with that if I say any of that wrong. But so we know that kids need to, before they leave elementary school, have, ideally before they get to 4th grade, have a strong grasp of most decoding skills. And then by the time they get to middle school, they certainly don't get that instruction anymore unless they're have an IEP. So given where he is, one way to look at how long, given his rate of progress thus far in the Spire curriculum, one way to look at whether he's closing the gap is to consider if he continues to receive this level of instruction, how long will it take for him to complete mastery of these basic word reading, decoding skills? And a very simplistic way to look at that would be to say he's done, maybe he'll get 2 levels done this year. Well, that means it's going to be 3 more years before he finishes, unless he speeds up somehow. That's a very different picture from an M class that shows he's making above average growth in word reading fluency. And that's because that measure is comparing him to where he was, which was extraordinarily low. So yes, his growth looks great, but it doesn't mean anything unless you put it in the context of where he needs to be, hopefully before he goes to middle school. And the way I look at him is that that's not going to happen if we just keep doing what we're doing. So would any of you other people out there like to comment on that before I talk about what I think might be a proper response to a child like this? Melanie and Beth, I'm talking to you.
I'm just gonna say I feel bad for the parents because I see a battle maybe that they might have to tackle to get the school understanding. That's
Well,
coming from a parent's perspective.
exactly, exactly. And that's a perspective I try to always consider. All right,
Dr.
anybody else?
Felton,
Yes,
remind us again, we had a question. How old was the child again? What grade? Just
he's
to
in the 3rd grade.
3rd grade. Okay.
Just, he was identified prior to 3rd grade as specific learning and started receiving services. He had gotten some level of intervention prior to that in 2nd grade. So he's going to 4th grade.
Going into 4th grade. And it sounds like working still on some, at most schools, what would be considered kindergarten level skills, right? With those CBC
Yes.
work.
Yes. So my point is that we need to be careful when I think there's too much emphasis on M-class data. It has its place, but it can be, I would contend that in this case, and I see this a lot, it's very misleading. Yes, we can say he's progressing, but he's not anywhere near where he needs to be. So what can we do when that is the case? And the only response that I know that's appropriate, at this point it's too late to do better early intervention. I mean, we could say ideally he would have gotten better early intervention. And I don't know what he got. I don't have any way of determining that at this point. But at this point, and there are lots of kids that get to this point, the only way I know to address this particular issue is to increase the intensity of the specially designed instruction. And by that, I mean a number of things, potentially. I think of tremendous importance is ensuring that the reading program and the resources that have been used to teach the child are appropriate. In this case, the SPIRE program, used appropriately, is a good program. Sometimes I have another student that I'm working with right now who's very much in this same situation, and the school he's attending, a charter school, does not use any program. So I worry a little bit more about that particular situation. But here, let's just say that the reading program that's being used is a good basic program for teaching a kid decoding skills. It includes all the things that we know are important. This particular kid does not have a significant phonological awareness deficit, which is good. So once the program has been determined to be appropriate, and there are times when I see kids that are so severe that I say they need the most intensive, most comprehensive reading program that there is out there. And if I'm asked to name what my choice is, I choose Wilson Reading System for a number of reasons. But that's not where I am with this particular child. So it's got a good reading program. So the next question is his teacher adequately trained both in science of reading and in using Spire? So that is something that parents need to feel comfortable asking, because no program in and of itself is going to teach a kid to read. We have to have teachers who understand the needs of children and how to make adjustments when necessary and how to use the program accurately. So that's, once you determine if the program is appropriate, then I think the next thing to look at is the teacher who's using the program knowledgeable enough to meet this particular child's needs. Another thing to look at is, what's the group size? If you have a child who's in a group of 6 or 7 kids, it's going to dilute the intensity of the instruction that child is getting. So sometimes I end up recommending that the child be worked with in a much smaller group or even one-on-one. Another thing to discuss or to think about is how much instructional time is being provided and how frequently. So I am unfortunately seeing, and I think this is probably related, sadly, to the lack of special educators that we have. I'm seeing systems limit instruction with the EC teacher to 30 minutes. And that's simply not going to be sufficient. Another issue that fits into intensity is not only how much time, how frequently, the size of the group, but also extended school year. And I know that extended school year is hard to get, but I recommend strongly that parents and professionals advocate for using the extended school year option, which is not that the child's going to regress and not even that the benefits will be jeopardized, but that it's an emerging skill acquisition, because we have good, strong research data that if kids don't master basic word reading skills by the time they leave 3rd grade, it is much, much harder for them to do so. They can, but it takes much more time, effort, intensity of instruction. So I would make the case, will make the case with this little boy. He's been turned down for extended school year so far, but I'm going to make the case, try to make the case that continuing his instruction year round is critical for him to master these skills. So I open it up for discussion, and happy to take any questions.
Questions, feel free to use the chat or unmute yourselves. Thank you for those suggestions, Dr. Felton. Those are all great things to consider and discuss with the team.
It's not easy, but I have seen it. I just tested, or not tested, but reviewed records for a student in middle school who has been provided 45 minutes a day, one-on-one instruction in corrective reading. And this is a kid who was hardly able to read at all going into 7th grade. And he's responding really, really well. But I've never seen a school provide 45 minutes one-on-one instruction 5 days a week. But that's what they're doing for this student for whatever reason. And I didn't have anything to do with it. But he's really progressing. Now he's still going to be way behind 8th grade now, but he's making much more progress than he would have made, I expect, if he had been in a classroom full of kids. So
Absolutely. All right, well, as you all ponder thoughts or questions, I have one for you. So I know a scenario probably many of us see or experience is there's a big gap in many areas, right? So gap in decoding, gap in fluency, gap in math, gap in spelling, gap in writing. Maybe there's a big gap in many areas. And so potentially the IEP may have 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 goals potentially. Any thoughts on, and they're years behind. Do you ever find that sometimes you're recommending, given the finite amount of time a child can get special instruction in a week, that you may have to prioritize some targets, even though they are behind in all these areas? I don't know. Any thoughts on that? That's something I see and experience a lot. We've got 15 things we need to work on, but obviously very limited time, as you said. So any thoughts on that when there's gaps in so many areas?
absolutely. So I think it's important to look at what the foundational skills are that help build fluency and comprehension, and written expression. So we know that being able to read words efficiently, by that I mean accurately and without extreme effort, requires decoding, and it requires recognizing some words that are irregular. That is a key component for both comprehension and for fluency. So if that's part of the child's problem, then that's where the emphasis should be initially. So as quickly as possible, get that kid to where they're accurately and efficiently reading and spelling, because spelling is equally important for writing. And I think the other aspects of comprehension and written expression can be handled in the general ed classroom. We have technology where things can be read to kids. You can have them speech to print, so they see their things. So you're not working on those things, but I think it does a disservice to dilute the instructional time by trying to do everything.
Absolutely. So prioritizing those foundational skills.
And giving enough time in instruction to move the child as quickly as possible through those foundational skills.
Perfect. Thank you. Any other thoughts or questions around looking
I had
at
a question or a comment. Sorry, I'm also kind of feeling under the weather. So, and I came on late. I apologize. I had another meeting. Rebecca, I was curious about, because my daughter, I think you and I have had multiple conversations
Yes.
over the phone. So it's good to see you today. With my daughter, she's in 3rd grade. So what you were just talking about, that example kind of resonated somewhat with me. And one of the things I'm curious about is when you're not maybe seeing these scores but you're seeing the progress at home, like how that really kind of contributes to what instruction she's getting in school. And again, I'll just kind of add, my daughter does outside private lessons with the tutor twice a week, and that's made a huge impact. So that's kind of where I feel like I have a hard time delineating what the school is actually doing for her growth as compared to what the private therapist is doing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. I don't think you can disentangle. I think the good news is that she's making, if she's making progress that you can see, as long as you can continue to provide the extra help, it's probably, hopefully working together. I think the thing that I would say is important if you have outside tutoring is to try to have some coordination so that the teachers are trying to reinforce what the other is doing, not teaching in a totally different sequence and perhaps overwhelming. But it sounds like it is working. So
Yes.
it really doesn't matter. The only way to tell if where it's coming from is to stop one or the other. And that could be risky to do.
Yes, and I think you spoke to a good example of, we do set up those communication every year, but then of course, as the child moves through the grade level, I feel like we have to start back at this beginning again with establishing that relationship with her outside tutor, which eats into a lot of wasted time. And that's one of the struggles that I see, is continuing that bridge.
Yeah, I don't know any way around that, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. Thanks for joining us. All right, I know we've just hit 1:30. I want to be mindful of everyone's time, especially Dr. Felton's time. Anything else you'd like to share? Thoughts, questions? We're so thankful to have you all with us today. Heidi says, thank you. Yes, yes. Oh, we're so happy to host this. So happy to host this, everyone. Oh, I'm glad. I'm glad this has been helpful. Lots of positive information. I do want to let everyone know every event that we have, such as today, last week, we had an incredible presenter around dysgraphia. All of these are recorded and they are all there for you on our website. We have slides and video recordings and access to whoever the presenter was. So please be on the lookout for that. We'll have the recording out. Check out our other recent events. And Dr. Felton, anything you'd like to end with? Any last thoughts or insights?
Just to parents, to feel free to ask for help. A lot of the people on this call are professionals too, and I know all of the people that are on this call that I recognize. I know they're always happy to help. So don't hesitate to ask people for help and to go to your teachers. Most of the teachers that I have worked with really, really want to help kids. So don't hesitate to ask. And don't hesitate to share your observations of what you're seeing and what you see your child needs.
Absolutely.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Felton. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe and warm if you're in a snowy spot today. All right, and take care.
Thanks.
Thank you. I'll stop the recording.